and the siege succeeded in its aim as General Westmoreland rushed combat forces to the northern areas. On January 31st, all major cities and 36 of 44 provincial capitals, along with numerous other towns, came under simultaneous attack by Southern NLF resistance forces, Viet Cong, along with some NVA elements. The effects are succinctly summarized by Wallace Thies in his scholarly study of the U.S. strategy of coercing Hanoi. Although U.S. military commanders would later claim that the offensive had been anticipated and that the heavy casualties suffered by the attackers had resulted in a great victory for the Allies, the offensive was in fact a military setback for the American side. To see the threat in the northern provinces and forestall a Dien Bien Phu-type defeat at Khe Sanh, half of all U.S. maneuver battalions in South Vietnam were deployed in I Corps in the north. The rest, along with the bulk of the combat-ready ARVN, GVN, Government of South Vietnam units, were tied down defending the cities against the possibility of a second wave of attacks. As a result, the countryside went by default to the NLF. The pacification program was left in a shambles, and whatever losses the DRV-VC, North Vietnamese Viet Cong, forces did suffer in the initial assaults were largely offset by the unimpeded recruiting that they conducted in the rural areas in the weeks that followed. International Voluntary Services, IVS, which had a close familiarity with the situation in rural areas, withdrew most of its field workers in early 1968 because of security conditions. A volunteer reported in February, "The number of locations at which we can safely place a volunteer have significantly decreased in recent months." Another added that, "We all knew that security in the countryside was getting worse and worse." Contrary to the optimistic evaluations of the U.S. High Command and Washington, which were relayed with little skepticism by the media in the pre-Tet period. A South Vietnamese senator estimated that after Tet, the government controlled only one-third of the country, the remaining two-thirds being in the hands of the NLF, an estimate consistent with U.S. intelligence reports. The Tet Offensive left Washington in a state of troubled confusion and uncertainty, Undersecretary of the Air Force Townsend Hoops observed, and performed the curious service of fully revealing the doubters and dissenters to each other in a lightning flash within the Pentagon. While General Westmoreland persisted with the optimistic assessments that had been undermined by the dramatic demonstration that the NLF remained firmly rooted in the South despite the devastating American attack on the rural society, the reaction in official Washington circles was quite different. Summarizing the impact in Washington, George Herring observes that in private, Johnson and his advisers were shocked by the suddenness and magnitude of the offensive, and intelligence estimates were much more pessimistic than Westmoreland. An air of gloom hung over the White House discussions, General Maxwell Taylor later observed, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Earl Wheeler likened the mood to that following the First Battle of Bull Run. General Wheeler reported that to a large extent the VC now controlled the countryside, the situation being particularly bad in the Mekong Delta, and the Pentagon Systems Analysis Group concluded that our control of the countryside and the defense of the urban areas is now essentially at pre-August 1965 levels, when the U.S. war was being lost, according to General Westmoreland. A U.S. government military historical summary of the offensive in the Mekong Delta, completed in April 1968, concluded that the Tet Offensive in Fourth Corps had a devastating effect on the Revolutionary Development Pacification Program. As we shall see, these internal assessments are considerably more pessimistic than those of the media that are denounced for the crime of excessive pessimism by Freedom House standards. We might incidentally note that in Fourth Corps, including the Mekong Delta, there were no regular North Vietnam units, according to Defense Secretary McNamara. The Freedom House study states that in the southernmost delta, it was an ARVN Viet Cong, actually U.S. Viet Cong guerrilla struggle, and more generally, Hanoi had yet to commit sizable multi-division forces in sustained concerted attacks anywhere in South Vietnam. These assessments are what motivated the mass slaughter campaign carried out in the rural areas of the Delta and elsewhere in the post-Tet accelerated pacification campaign discussed earlier. Even before the Tet Offensive, Defense Secretary McNamara had privately concluded that military victory was an unreasonable objective and that the course of the war should be changed. Clark Clifford, who was brought in to replace him after Tet, had long shared such doubts, and they were reinforced by the evidence available to him and by the conclusions of the wise men whom Johnson called in to assess the situation. Dean Acheson, who headed this group of longtime hawks drawn from business and political elites, agreed with Clifford's pessimism and advised Johnson to scale down ground operations, reduce the bombing, and seek every means of terminating hostilities without abandoning South Vietnam. The wise men, after full briefings from diplomatic and military officials, confirmed Atchison's findings. The consensus, as summed up by one of the participants, was that there are no military conclusions in this war, or any military end in the future, so that Johnson should therefore de-escalate the conflict. Notice that at this point some rather serious problems arise concerning the second component of the Freedom House thesis, that the misdeeds of the media caused the public to oppose the war, undermining government resolve and leading to U.S. failure in its, by definition, benevolent aims. To establish the stab-in-the-back component of the Freedom House thesis, it is necessary to show that public opinion was swayed toward opposition to the war by media coverage, and that the media and public opinion were a significant factor in the shift of government policy. Neither claim can be sustained. With regard to the course of public opinion, the Freedom House study decisively refutes its own thesis. It includes a chapter on public opinion polls by Burns-Roper, which demonstrates, as Braystrup concedes, that there is no available evidence of a direct relationship between the dominant media themes in early 1968 and changes in American mass public opinion vis-à-vis the Vietnam War itself, but rather a continuing slow drift toward the Dove side after an initial wave of support for the president and frustration and anger at the foe during the Tet Offensive. A closer examination of their own data undermines the Freedom House thesis even more thoroughly. The early response to the Tet Offensive, during the period when media incompetence and unwarranted pessimism were allegedly at their height, was an increase in the belligerency of the American public. The immediate reaction of the U.S. public was to favor stiffened resistance, that is, U.S. resistance to an attack by South Vietnamese in South Vietnam, and intensified U.S. effort. The major sentiment aroused was, bomb the hell out of them. In late February and March, when the media, in the Freedom House version, were beginning to whisper the true story of American victory, there developed a decided negative reaction to the president's handling of the war and the war itself, and a distinct opposition to more aggressive U.S. military action. In early February 1968, when the impact of the alleged media distortions and pessimism reached its peak, public opinion shifted toward the Hawks. Public opinion returned to the pre-Tet figures by late February, when the media were allegedly correcting their earlier errors. By April, after the offensive had ended and the errors had been overcome, albeit in a whisper, there was a sharp shift toward the Doves. By April, May, June, measurements had returned to pre-Tet levels. When looked at on this broader timescale, the Tet Offensive appears merely to have caused a minor ripple in a steady changing attitude toward our involvement in the war, a shift toward the position of the Doves after an initial shift toward the Hawks during the period of media pessimism. Tet was just one more incident that reminded the public that the war was not going well, that the confident predictions out of Washington had to be taken with a grain of salt, and that helped move public opinion in the anti-war direction in which it had been moving for nearly 3 years. Faced with this thorough refutation of one essential component of their thesis, without which the thesis loses all significance even if the residue were tenable, the Freedom House analysts retreat to the position that although the public was unaffected by the perverse behavior of the media, there was an effect on the nation's leadership segment, Burns, a safer claim since, as they concede, no data are available. The director of the Freedom House study, Leonard Sussman, concludes that the Tet Offensive, as portrayed in the media, appeared to have had a far greater effect on political Washington and the administration itself than on the U.S. population's sentiment on the war. The media failures, in short, left the public unaffected or even more supportive of the war while they misled the government, along with presidential advisor Clark Clifford, the wise men from the corporate political and military elites, including former top-level military commanders, and such media addicts as Dean Acheson, Henry Cabot Lodge, McGeorge Bundy, Douglas Dillon, Robert Murphy, etc. We are asked to believe that their decision to move toward disengagement in a situation that they perceived as one of stalemate was based not on military briefings, intelligence reports, and all the information available at the highest level to official Washington, but on watching the evening news with Walter Cronkite. In short, we can dismiss out of hand the second component of the Freedom House thesis, the component that had dramatic impact and continuing influence within the post-Vietnam right turn among elites, and that has set the agenda for subsequent discussion about the adversarial stance of the media and its grim consequences. We are left with the conclusion that the media were either irrelevant or that they continued to operate within the general confines of the approved ideological system, thus refuting the first component of the thesis as well. All that remains of the Freedom House story is the possibility that the media were incompetent, even malevolent, but ineffectual. Notice that the Freedom House thesis here faces the same logical problem noted earlier with regard to the charges concerning television. If television is as influential as claimed, then the evidence shows that through 1967, it encouraged a decisive majority of viewers to support the war. To evaluate the remaining shreds of the Freedom House thesis, let us continue with the record of the Tet Offensive, now asking whether the media did in fact distort it in their zealous, although utterly ineffectual, efforts to undermine authority. With lavish use of firepower, U.S. forces succeeded in regaining control of the towns and cities. The city of Hue, which had been conquered from its own population by GVN troops with American assistance several months earlier in a desperate U.S. effort to prevent the growth of popular movements calling for democracy and a negotiated political settlement, was 80% destroyed by bombing and shelling, which left 2,000 civilians buried in the smashed ruins, according to U.S. Air Force Undersecretary Townsend Hoops. The Marines listed communist losses at over 5,000, while Hoops states that a sizable part of the communist force of 1,000 men who captured the city escaped, allowing a determination of who constituted the communist losses. U.S. aid in May estimated that some 4,000 civilians were left dead in the ruins of the city, most of them victims of U.S. firepower. In the Mekong Delta, artillery and airstrikes leveled half of My Ta, a city of 80,000, and the provincial capital of Ben Tre, Kien Hoa province, later devastated in the post-Tet terror campaign, with 140,000 inhabitants, was decimated with the justification, as an American colonel put it in one of the most widely quoted statements of the war, "We had to destroy the town to save it." The U.S. command conceded that the enemy were overwhelmingly NLF, not North Vietnamese. Killed and captured outnumbered captured weapons by a factor of 5, an indication of who the enemy really were. Secretary of Defense McNamara estimated NVA